Hello, everybody. How are you today? So, we're going to dive. There's so much to go through today. And I'm going to just adjust the camera just a little bit. It's okay if you didn't read this book, but I'm going to open up the chat real quick so I can see you guys. How many of you actually got to read at least some of the book? Just like type a little bit. Yeah, good. I'm glad to see some of you did. I'm going to be going through it, not completely in depth, but let me talk about what I'm going to be teaching versus what is in this book. So inside of this book, this has all of the mythologies, the stories that go behind the rituals that I will be talking about today. You can still understand Samhain without this book, but it is really helpful to understand the mythology behind what was going on. So hello, everyone. Welcome. This is our first book club for Mystery School, and this book is called The Pagan Mysteries of Halloween. When we talk about pagans here, we are specifically referring to the Celtic tradition that was found in Ireland as well as in Scotland. Now, it's important to talk about why I chose this author because Jean Markale was actually a little bit of a controversial choice. So I don't know if you guys have seen what this guy looks like. He's a little crazy looking. Now, Jean Markale was a very prominent academic philosopher and mystic during the 20th century. And whenever I look for books, it's really important for me that I find an academic source. I want to make sure that when I open this book up, I can refer, oh, hello, kitty. I can refer to all of the research that he's done so I know I'm not just reading like someone's random understanding of it. That's really important to me. Of course, personal gnosis has its place, but when we are doing education on history, it's incredibly important to have academic sources. So Jean Markale popped up on my research on Goodreads when I was looking for books on Samhain. I always use Goodreads and Amazon to double check the reviews of books that I am going to be teaching or using for any kind of purpose or even just for personal reading. So when I was reading the book reviews on the Pagan Mysteries of Halloween, I saw lots of great stuff. People here suggested that he has some of the best information regarding the mythology, as well as his history in specialization of Celtic rituals. I learned a little bit about him by going to his Wikipedia page. And I saw that the author was certainly not without his faults, although he was a specialist in France. He does have controversy around his name. Specifically in 1989, he was pointed out for being a plagiarist. And I guess a lot of people don't like his writing style. I personally really enjoyed his writing style. It's very conversational. I think it's a little bit more easy to read than just pure academic state. That being said, it can be confusing, and especially for academics who are talking about this in a, the 20th century, very hard factual evidence is not the easiest for serious academics to really dive into and like give points to. But that being said, I found the conversational writing a lot more inviting and more fun to read personally. I looked at some of his other books as well. I don't know if I would recommend all of them, but I certainly found some great stuff on Atlantis by Jean Markale. So I recommend that if you found this book interesting or you find this perspective interesting, I recommend that you take a look at it and see what else you can learn from him. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2008. This was one of his last books that he actually wrote in 2000. So it's a fairly recent addition to his library. And I have to say that this book did not fail me. It was very insightful and sometimes actually shocking. So before we dive right into the book, hey, everybody. I see some of us are just joining. It's important to get perspective. And remember that whenever we study the occult, or whenever we study anything related to magic, that we cannot judge it from our 21st century perspective. We have to go back in time and think like the ancient Celtic people did in this case. Other times it's going to be various traditions. So the first thing we need to understand is how the Celtic people understood the year. They did not use the Gregorian calendar that we use today. They actually mapped out the year quite differently. They only had 4 major holidays, and these holidays were chosen by the solar or cosmic interactions between living beings and the cosmos. The Celtic people believed that the cosmos and living things were interconnected. There was no separation between ordinary life and magical life. It was all one. It's also important that there are only 2 seasons in the Celtic tradition. There are the dark months, which is called winter, and then there are the luminous months, which are called summer. So the 4 main holidays in the Celtic calendar, starting with the dark months, are November 1st, which is Samhain, and February 1st, which is Imbolc. And then we go into the luminous part of the year, which is May 1st, which is Beltane, and then August 1st, which is, I'm going to try my best, Lugnach, which we also know as Lammas in our modern day. And you may notice that there are a lot of correlations to the witches calendar, or what I teach as the cosmic calendar, because as we will learn as we go farther through the subject, that our modern understanding is really a hodgepodge mix mash of a lot of different cultures put together. So November 1st, Samhain. Why is it called Samhain? Well, honestly, it's not a really special meaning behind it. It simply means the weakening of summer. This is an old Gaelic term. It could also mean the end of summer. Nothing super special there. Imbolc is the halfway point through the dark months. Beltane is the beginning of summer, and Luxnad or Lammas is the halfway point between summer. It's also really important to understand that in the ancient world, there was absolutely no difference between what is sacred and what is profane. They were connected. What is sacred is profane, what is profane is sacred. Very hard concept to comprehend in our modern world, but bear with me, it will make more sense as we get into this. It's also important to notice that these dates are all set on the 1st. Why is that? It's because those dates were chosen for to be closest to the full moon. The ancient Druids, that's what we know about them, that they worked around the moon calendar. There are no written or historical records of ancient Druidic practices. There's just not. It was an oral language. The most that we have regarding ancient Druidic practices actually come from the Christianized written down versions. So that's really important to understand as well, that if anyone ever tells you they practice ancient Druidic practices, that they're full of shit, because we don't have that kind of work. So let's talk about what god rules over Samhain. So according to Markale, the ancient Celtics worshipped a completely unknowable god. He was all-powerful, all-knowing, and completely incomprehensible to us. He was just God, just like this vast void we don't understand. But due to the intermingling of cultures, particularly with Greek and Rome coming into Ireland and Scotland in the early millennia, it's important to see that they actually attributed some of their own gods to this specific holiday. And the one character that stands out to Markale is called Lugh, of the long arm and master of the arts. That is Lugh. This god was also incorporated into the Roman version of Mercury, according to Caesar, in the writing of Be Bello Glacio. It's important to understand that this like mix really happened in Gaul, which is now modern day France. And that's where some of the rituals started to change and intermix a little bit. This is also a really good time to state that according to Markale, Samhain starts on the eve of October 1st. And there are references that say that Samhain should last 3 days. Some even say it should be 3 days before and then 3 days after. You may recognize that 3 is a really important number. We also see this in Christianity, the 3 days when Jesus rose from the dead. As we get more into this theme, you will notice that death and resurrection are a large part of Samhain and the celebration of Halloween. Now, in ancient times, it was a crime not to celebrate Samhain. It was the most important day of the year because not only was it the new year for the Celts, but it was so much more than that. It was a holiday of mythical, political, and legislative importance. There are so many things that happen on Samhain, and I'll get into it in a second. But it's important to know that you would be punished if you did not participate in Samhain, if you did not recognize or pay reverence to this festival. And some legends say that those who did not were punished by the god and driven mad. So Samhain in the ancient Celtic times was a military festival, first of all. Included a lot of drunkenness, and it also was a time for political legislative assembly where kings and dukes would all get together and they would do their legislative business. This was also a time of the renewal of the king's powers, which is very important and will be talked about later in our rituals. It was also a judicial assembly. Judicial and legislative are different. Legislative means that's passing of laws. Judicial assembly is the resolution of internal conflict that is between either landowners or farmers or family feuds. That is what that is representing of. This is also Samhain when we would start recording the collective memory. This was not till the Christianized version of Samhain, but these are the originations of what we now call annals, or in modern times we call them minutes of a meeting. Very interesting stuff. Other things that we see associated with Samhain are the renewal or creation of economic contracts. And we also see the redistribution of communal properties. And then, of course, the fun stuff. This is a suspended moment in time. For 3 days, like the world stops. We only focus on the celebration. There's feast, drink in excessive amounts. There's music, song, and rituals. And of course, the intimate contact with the other world. It's important to know that Markale uses the term other world and invisible world interchangeably. We'll get into that in just a second. So what's with all this drunkenness? Why is everyone drunk? Why are we all drinking on Samhain? There's actually a reason behind that. So in ancient Celtic understanding, it was a way to raise the energy. There's actually a really good section in this book that describes the raising of energy as an orgy. This does not mean sexual orgies. I'm going to read to you from the book itself what an orgy is. Orgies were times when traditional values, if not scorned, were at least inverted. What was forbidden became permissible, and what was permitted became forbidden. It's important to understand that Samhain in many ways is like Saturnella in Rome or the Carnival in Venice. So it may have included sexual appetites, but actually most of the time it's talking about a raising of energy. So the Celts referred to this drunkenness as we call being in the middle, meaning that you were in the middle between the real world, the tangible world, and the other world, the invisible world. Being drunk across cultures from ancient Egypt to Judaism to the Celts was known as what it's called unhooking. What happens is when you drink, you are inebriating your mind, unhooking your spirit from your body. It is said that sometimes when you are drunk, your body can be taken over by other spirits. In this case, it's less threatening, saying that your soul is able to comprehend and pass through the other world easier. That's it. So let's move on to some rituals. Now, again, it's very important when we talk about these rituals that the sacred and the profane were the same for the ancient Celts. There was no good or bad. In fact, sin was not even an idea in their culture at that time. That doesn't mean people could be be bad in a say, like they can break the law, but the idea of sin as eternal punishment did not exist. So, rituals developed out of stories. These myths and stories actually change over time. So things that I'm going to talk about actually have different cycles. And that is because we think of it as like a remake of a TV show. So we have a movie from the 1980s, but it's being remade for the audiences in 2020 to understand. Very similar with what happens in mythologies in the ancient times. So the first ritual we're going to talk about is the sacrificial ritual. Now, there are 3 cycles of the sacred animal that is chosen in Irish mythology. The first one, actually all of them, really hinder on what is sustaining life at that time. So our first cycle, they all have names referred to the different myths, but I'm not going to get into that. You can read that in the book. The first animal is the stag, S-T-A-G. Stags were hunted during the Paleolithic Ice Age in order to sustain and feed tribes. This was considered a sacred animal. A slaughtering of that animal to the god was considered, again, a renewal. It was considered a contract. Blood being spilled also has a lot of different meanings, but mostly it's again, a profane way of the sacred. Very interesting. Now, the next sacrifice we actually still see pretty prominent today is the sacrificial bull. This animal was chosen at a time where farmers had cows, and the bull was there to help create babies, so the farmers could continue to create their dairy products and have a sustainable life. The bull, in essence, was part of their life force, just as the stag had been previously. And again, those stories start to rotate out as new generations come forward. And lastly, and probably the most surprising, is the pig. The pig is most interesting because it's often disliked or considered dirty or evil in the Hebrew and Abrahamic religions. But here in Irish lore, the pig is sacred because it is an animal of the other world, as well as being a food source and a sustainable source. I really wish Markale had gotten into that some more, but he doesn't really explain in this book why pigs are sacred, so that's my next research topic. So that is ritual 1 that we see, is the sacrifice of a sacred animal. We see this across cultures. The next ritual we have relates to sacred fire. As we will talk about later regarding Christians' All Saints' Day, that the ritual fire plays a huge role in Samhain because it is light. Markale explains that the past year is symbolically extinguished. So there was a fire, they extinguish it, and then symbolically, the world is plunged into darkness. And then the Druids, or in this case, they would call them the gods, because they are working as the gods, would open the new year by lighting a new sacred fire in which a sacred virtue had been conferred. This is a spiritual fire that will stay lit year-round to help guide the community through the darkness, because remember, Samhain is the new year in the middle of the dark. So we see this again across bonfires, very popular this time of year. Turns out they have a stronger meaning than just being a fun hangout. Now, this one was probably my favorite ritual I learned about. And honestly, it really changed some perspectives for me. So, in the ancient world in Ireland, Samhain was the time to harvest mistletoe. We think of mistletoe as a New Year's thing or a Christmas thing. Well, it is part of the new year, but in ancient times, Samhain was the new year. And the new year that we express now, it has been arbitrarily moved, according to Markale. So in ancient time, this was a time to harvest this plant. And I just thought that was really interesting. So mistletoe is actually used for Halloween. So this is where things get a little bit more difficult to understand, because this is where we really have to take our mind and go from what is good and evil in our modern understanding, and we have to remove it. Remember, the sacred is profane, the profane is sacred. There is no differentiation. So probably the most important ritual of Samhain was the death and rebirth of a king. This was to test the king's worthiness. Markale explains that there's often a wear and tear on power. How well is the king performing? How well are we starting, how well is he helping the society? And it's also really important to say that, even if the king isn't responsible for disasters or famine or climate conditions, even civil war, it did not matter. he took full responsibility for it because he is basically the manager of that society at the time. So, in order to have a death and rebirth, we start to see this ritual come out most clearly through the god Lugh. Remember, that's the Greek name of Mercury. Gosh, I'm going to try. Tiataus. And this was honored in modern France, also known as Gaul. A man is plunged into a great cauldron where he suffocates. As strange and grotesque as that is, this is where the idea of the witch's cauldron comes from. Remember that cauldrons are not a sign of death. They're actually a sign of immortality and rebirth. We see this in other rituals where they would cook the sacred animal inside of a cauldron, and by eating that meat, you would become, your soul would be nourished as being spiritually immortal. We start to see that cauldrons were used across several different Celtic and Gaelic traditions, and they are always connected to the underworld, not the underworld, the other world, completely different, not the underworld. Understand that cauldrons are healing and restoring life. Even though it includes death, death is necessary for rebirth. This is a new year. This is a cycle that we are repeating. It is also, as I said before, kind of like a checks and balances on society. The wear and tear of power is now being corrected. So I didn't really get this ritual, and the ancient people understood it and it meant something to them. It may not mean anything to us now, but what I do understand is that this ritual was a physical, spiritual, and very tragic play, a story that is being played out. That is how humans based their lives around stories, around these themes. So we understand that although the king has been suffocated within the cauldron, through alchemy or the transformation of energy or magic, this king will be reborn. The tragic death of the king happens so he can be reborn as a better leader and as a better human being. This is a regeneration of power, as I've said. And through this rebirth, we know that the king actually goes into the other world. She becomes stronger and better. He learns something and then comes back to face the new year. I'm going to read for you now the description of what the other world is according to the Celtic tradition. For those of you who have the book, it's on page 44. The other world is everywhere and nowhere. The invisible is immediately behind the visible. It is enough to have a famous gift of second sight to see it. In principle, it is people who have undergone some form of initiation who possess this gift. It can happen that on certain dates, any human being has the potential to perceive this invisible world and even enter it with impunity. This is precisely what is happening during the time of Samhain. Countless stories and mythologies emphasize the favorable relationship that allows access to the sacred and talismans from the other world. And then he goes into a story. So in the Celtic world, there is no judgment after death. Again, they did not have any conception of sin. Everybody had a right to go to the other world after death. There's no differentiation between good and evil. We also know that this is a place where wisdom is housed. In the Celtic worldview, this is also known as a time for the passage of souls. Now, Christians really clung on to this. This is where Christians say Samhain is the day where souls in purgatory could be moved from purgatory into heaven. Their souls would be cleansed. And in fact, that goes way beyond Christianity to a Hermetic text that we talked about last week called the Emerald Tablet. Now, in this mural, this tablet expresses that mounds, because we used burial mounds, would open and the dead and the living could mingle together. This is Halloween. This is where we start to see that the mounds opening and the procession of the dead connects to children and the processions of the dead. It is important to remember, again, the sacred is profane, but is also very dangerous. Any choice that you make to dance or intermingle with the other world is a dangerous endeavor, which is why Christians added another holiday called All Saints' Day. Now, it's important to understand that Samhain and All Saints' Day are two sides of the same coin. There's both the light aspect of Samhain, where we have the ritual fires, and we also have the darkness, the ability of the dead to intermingle with the living. So tragedies are one of the strongest stories that we can tell as human beings. They touch us the most, they inspire us, and even instill fear into us. And especially in the Hellenic tradition, this bled into Christianity. So let's go through that, what that means. So we have the Irish Gaelic people over here. We have the Romans and the Greeks. We all intermingled together. Now we're back in Rome. We have some of these Irish traditions, and then Christianity pops up. And Christians say, oh, you celebrate this thing? Cool. We're going to take it, rework it, and you're still going to celebrate it, but with Jesus. So it's important to note that the church specifically sees Samhain as a day to celebrate profanity and express tragedy. Basically, this is their version of the purge. They're like, here, have all of these bad feelings, but then you have the light feelings afterwards, the feel good feelings. So we see this a couple of times throughout the year. We see this not only on Samhain, but Mardi Gras, where all of that profane, crazy stuff happens. You get it out of your system, and then you go into Lent. This is a very interesting tradition, something that I noticed that really struck me during my reading. It's important to note that these sacred holidays also include tragedy. So the Day of Light, All Saints' Day, is honoring those who were usually martyrs, people who have it right with God. And it's supposed to be a celebration of joy and eternal life. Kind of find that hard when most people were murdered, but to each his own. We also see that this understanding falls into the ancient rituals of the Celtics as death and rebirth. So even though that the saints were martyrs or murdered, they now are granted eternal light and eternal life. So how did All Saints' Day begin? Well, the first inklings of All Saints' Day actually happened in 731, by a man named Pope Gregory III. Now, inside of St. Peter's Church in Rome, that's where we've got like the Sistine Chapel and whatnot, he built a very specific chapel inside this church called Chapel of All Saints, to All Saints. And he dedicated this chapel on November 1st. And this ritual was repeated every year, but only within Rome. It was not until 831, under the rule of Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, that the idea of All Saints' Day was celebrated everywhere. So, why did Pope Gregory III choose November 1st? It wasn't by accident. In fact, it was because during the 700s, there were many Irish clerics. And remember, all those people who are up here are now in Rome. All this stuff has been intermingled at this point. And it is very likely that these Irish clerics who held high council and were highly respected as scholars and theologians would have suggested this date to the Pope. Now, what's even crazier is that another day was built in. Now, this holiday is not often celebrated. I knew about it growing up Roman Catholic. It's mostly a Catholic thing. But there is a version of it is called Day of the Dead, not to be confused with the Mexican tradition of Dia de Muertos. The Day of the Dead in the Christian version is celebrated on November 2nd. Remember, it's a 3-day holiday. You have Samhain on the 31st, All Saints' Day on the 1st, and then on the second day, November 2nd, we have Day of the Dead. Now, this tradition was created in 994, by a saint, who I'm going to try really hard to pronounce his name, Odlin, Odilon of Mercure. And now he was considered to be a man of great charity, very pious, humble, had lots of love for the community, and also was a mystic. This was known. And he actually created this day very specifically for mourning. Mourning the dead is not this exciting, bright ceremony that we see in Mexico, but rather it is a very solemn day of prayer. We all wear black, we're all quiet. And this became commonplace in 1050 by the church. However, it's really interesting because the church never declared it as like a mandatory or compulsory holiday. And it wasn't until John Paul II in 1998, yeah, over 1,000 years later, they were like, this is now really a holiday, guys. That blows my mind. So Day of the Dead has a couple of other things associated with it. This is the day where souls could be purged from purgatory. How does this happen? Well, the idea is that because the intermingling of the other world and the visible world, the souls could come in, and there's a couple of things that they could do to like move past in their life. Now, the idea specifically of like finishing unfinished business or whatever, that didn't develop till much later. Originally, when this idea was introduced in 900, it is specifically there's like not as a big view of sin, and that's hard to explain because the Celtics viewed the dead coming through, there was no sin, and then the state of purification was added to the church. That's a little bit confusing, but the idea is that the souls like had to unfinished business didn't happen till later. This was just a natural state that they could intermingle, not necessarily finish things. The church actually eliminated all of the Samhain rituals that we talked about. So sacred fire, rebirth and death of a king, but they didn't, it's still there. And then we also have the sacred animal. So as we like chew on all of this, we've learned that the ancient Celts celebrated Samhain for 3 days. It was a suspension in time. We see the Catholic Church adopt that over time, allowing Samhain as this day of debauchery and profanity, All Saints Day as like the sacredness, and then we have Day of the Dead, which is a day of mourning and purification. Now, in the Celtic understanding of Samhain, all that stuff was the same thing. It all happened on the same day. There was no differentiation between good and evil. There was no like light and darkness. They were all intermingled and put together. So now the question is, how did we get from all of these sacred religious acts to Halloween, when we're giving out candy and celebrating and dressing up in costumes? How'd this happen? Well, I'm going to tell you something. It's really fresh. It's only about 100 years old. So before we get there, let's talk, and we're going to finish talking about purgatory. So in the Middle Ages, up into the Renaissance, the Catholic Church suggested for practitioners on the Day of the Dead to keep their doors ajar, food on the table, and a fire going for the passing dead. They called them their visitors, their dead relatives, whomever, to warm themselves and find cheer in the world before moving on to heaven. The idea of trick-or-treating very specifically started in Scotland in the 18th century. Now, this is where young people, mostly children, would dress up to personify spirits, hide their faces behind masks. And this is where our white sheet ghost comes from. That came from Scotland. The other thing they would do is there's our boo ghost, cute. And they would make costumes from straw, mostly representing animals. So again, we see that callback to sacred animals and the sacred sacrifice. So this procession was specifically to represent the passage of souls coming from the other world into the viable reality. We also see this is where jack-o'-lanterns come from. So in Scotland, children would use turnips or beets to carve faces into, or handprints. Handprints were very common. And this was a reflection of the unfixed spirit of the dead. It gives them light. Remember, we go back into Samhain, the ritual fire, guiding them through the new year, guiding them through the dark. That's what these lanterns are. And these children in Scotland would actually look for treats that people would lay out. And these are representations of our offerings to the dead, as we saw in the Catholic Church, opening our doors, opening our homes and food for the dead. So in the 19th century, when the Irish immigration really started to America, these traditions got mixed up even more. So pumpkins are native to North America, and nowadays in the 21st century and in the 20th and 21st century, pumpkins became more widespread on all 6 continents except Antarctica. But in America, specifically, the jack-o'-lantern was created and has become one of the prevailing icons in our culture. Now, the Irish believed that these pumpkins that were being carved were now representations of the soul, and that we put candles inside our jack-o'-lanterns to help bring souls to us who have not been able to find a place or heaven or hell yet, so they can have a guiding light home. So after over the last 100 years, from 1920 to 2020, we have seen a huge intermingling between these 3 holidays: Samhain, All Saints' Day, and the Christian Day of the Dead. And they've all kind of been mishmashed into 2 days. So we have the first, again, Samhain, which is now Halloween. All Hallows Eve, that came in the early 900s. Markale doesn't really talk a lot about that. I would like to learn more about that. I thought it was really interesting. And we also, during the spiritualist movement of the 1920s, we start to get this idea that like people who are not used to exploring the occult or having interactions with the other world are able to. But this is not a new idea. This dates all the way back to those ancient druids who believed that by excessive drinking and being in the middle, one could experience the other world. So the last thing I'm going to end on before I open up for class discussion is, how did Halloween become evil? Because as we've gone through this, there's nothing evil about it. This is simply a storytelling of our life. It is about the renewal of power. It's about death and rebirth to become a better person, and a honest and loving respect for those who have passed on. Well, unfortunately, after Vatican II and John Paul II, these Christian myths were created, really focusing on the devil and vilifying the old gods of paganism. So this new myth emerged that on Halloween, on the darkest day of the year, the devil comes up with his demons, or his creatures, as Markale calls them, to the earth to try to bring back as many souls as possible to hell. But let's talk about this from the book very specifically. I was very interested to read this. Okay. So in modern, this is talking about the 20th century, in modern days, everything that is not Christian must be a work of the devil. Now the devil, as we know, only thinks of doing evil. And in the case of Halloween night, he sends his creatures to earth in order to bring them back. We see that he's always present. And it is time for a person to decide which side he is on. Does one succumb to the temptations of Satan? Or do we not show fear and follow the light? One could even consider these horrible masks that appear during Halloween to cause fear and diabolical spirits calling them in. And at least of showing them is one and the same part of the sacred and the profane. So in the end, Christianity just brought back what we already knew. They just added another layer to it. The sacred and the profane are the same. There are 2 extremes on the same pole. which we will talk more about when we learn about Hermeticism. But the idea that Halloween is evil is super recent. And honestly, personally, I'm shocked that when we're shoving people in cauldrons in ancient times isn't considered, horrific or horrible. But it's all about our changing perspective, and how we view things in 2020 is completely different than the beginnings of this amazing holiday, as we know as Samhain. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to my 40-minute rant about this wonderful book. I am happy to allow you guys to unmute yourself to give comments. If you want me to read them in the chat, feel free to do that too. Oh, we've got Luna wants to chat. Let me unmute you. There you go.
So wasn't it like the 90s when like officially Halloween was like bad? That's
Yes,
what I read somewhere.
you're correct. And that has a lot to do with the
Yeah,
satanic.
really recently.
Yes. So we learned from the Satanic Panic, which happened that's right, in the 80s and the 90s, that there was this huge scare of devil worship and all this scary stuff. And that's when we really start seeing, the Catholic Church has always relied on fear, but really pushing into that, that this is the devil's work. Was there anything that you were surprised to learn?
I feel like the renewal of the king is it's a lot like a story of Jesus, but at the same time like from like Egyptian times, like the
Osiris.
I know it had to do with like being on the cross and on the cross there 3 days, and then there's like a rebirth or something, right?
Yeah, the resurrection, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of really interesting parallels. Now, note at the time that the Irish people and the Roman people, not the Romans, the Egyptians and the Hebrews, they didn't have any interaction. They came up with this on their own, which is why we see the Trinity, very sacred across cultures. We see this lots. We have something from Sophie. Bonfires seem to be a prevalent thing around the UK at this time, and I'm not sure if it has solely to do with the bonfire night, though. No, it probably doesn't. There's probably a lot of other mythology that's buried into that as well. Again, this book, really, you can go into a lot of stories, and like this is really what I loved about this book is the mythology behind it. Like I can hear and tell you why, but to really experience the stories of these people and understand what how they understood the world is really moving. So I have to say that honestly, for me, learning about Halloween is, I was really surprised to learn that there wasn't a whole, I don't know. I just imagined trick-or-treating to be a little bit older. Like, I don't know. Like the first 100 years to me was really kind of surprising. I was like, oh, this stuff hasn't been around that long. And then let's think about the commercialized version of Halloween, right? So in most of the Western world where we live in a society in which we can, everything is capitalized on, right? Like buy this, consume, consume, consume. So I just think it's super interesting that those rituals still live on even through capitalism. And I don't know, personally, that makes me really happy. Like the occult really prevails regardless through what economic structure you're in. Let's talk about this Halloween because it's very special. And it is called a blue moon. How many of you know what a blue moon is? Just say yes or no in the chat. Oh, yeah? I got some people know what's going on. Great. So for those of you who don't know, a blue moon is a special moon when in a month there are 2 full moons. Generally, we only have a 28-day cycle and there's only 1 full moon each month. Blue moon is when there's 2. What does this mean? Well, 1, the Gregorian calendar sucks and we miss a lot of time. 2, it's a very magical, heightened energy. In particular, in 2020, we are now what we call eclipse season. So eclipse season is when there are 3 eclipses that happen every year. They're not full eclipses. That's the one that the media gets really excited about. But we have a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse. This brings a very magical, special energy. In particular, it's going to bring a lot of changes to our environment, not the natural environment, but our societal environment. A lot of changes are going to be happening. And this full moon is also a super moon, which kind of amplifies everything. So this energy is going to get weird. There's a reason why people say people get weird around the full moon. Now take a full moon and an eclipse season and let's double it. That's what's happening this year. Not to scare you, not to freak you out, just letting you know that things are going to get a little crazy. So there's to be, what should you do on this blue moon? I'm not going to tell you what to do because honestly, I don't know. I don't know. You can you can try to manifest. Right now, manifesting is really hard because of relation to some other planets and where they're located. It's not great. I think the best way to celebrate Samhain and to celebrate Halloween is to give honor to those who have died. I think that is what we understand best right now, is that we have some loved ones who may have passed. Maybe we want to really get in touch with our ancestors. You can do some mirror scrying. That's probably really great. If you can get the full moon in your mirror and scry, that would be awesome. Also, something that I really recommend that I don't think that we do enough is just looking at the moon. You can go meditate, just go up, go look at the moon and meditate on it and like allow yourself to feel that cosmic presence, understanding that you are on a flying rock in the middle of space, flying around in a star. Like just go comprehend that for a little while. Your brain will turn mushy. I only have a picture of my grandma that passed. Can I cut myself from the picture? Good. Yes, very important. So when we make our ancestral altars, we never include any living person. TikTok kind of like blah about this. But yeah, guys, don't ever put yourself or a living person on the altar with the dead loved ones during this time. You're putting yourself in between worlds, can get very dicey. Make a copy of that photo because obviously you don't want to cut up the original photo. Make a copy, cut yourself out. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. It doesn't have to be super ornate either. Like my altars for my ancestors are very modest. It's got some crystals, it's got some plant, it's got like a bay leaf or some rosemary and a candle. That's it. Don't get caught up in the idea that your witchcraft has to be aesthetic. So I am so glad that you all really enjoyed this book. I'm going to give you the last couple of things that I thought were really great that you would enjoy if you have the book. So to understand exactly where the name of Samhain came from, you want to go to page 14 that talks about the etymology of Samhain, how that came about. The next page that I recommend is page 24. That is where they talk about the state of drunkenness, and now you all know what an orgy is, and it's not always a sexual debauchery. I also think page 44 is really important. That is the page where they talk about the other world. What is the other world in the Celtic mind? Understand it's not the underworld, it's not death, it's something totally different. And then again, that's also page 63. That also talks about how the other world interacts with this current world, this physical world. And the last page is actually going to be page 95, which talks about the Christian idea of purgatory and how that all got mishmashed together. So, oh, look at all these lovely comments. You were all so wonderful. Thank you for joining this lesson. I love you all so much. I'm so glad that you found this helpful and enjoyable. And we will see you around. Bye, everybody.